All right, we're going to get started here. I'd like to welcome everybody who's here in the room. My name is Lauran Hartley, and I'm the director of the Modern Tibetan Studies program here at Columbia University. We're seated at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. I'd like to thank Julie Kwan, who's here, who's offered so much support for setting this up, for the Weatherhead for providing funding, there'll be several other people to thank this evening as well. Tonight is it's an event, we're kind of wrapping about four things into one. First of all, our Modern Tibetan Studies program is now 25 years old. We celebrate the 25th anniversary this year. We are very happy about that. And we are here to welcome our 11 visiting international exchange entrepreneurs from Ladakh, from northern Nepal, and from Dharamsala. So I'd like to briefly introduce that program and then also invite one of our international exchange speakers to speak just briefly here. So what we did this year we had funding from the Department of State, the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs supplies funding for international exchange. And it's a two-way thing. And our program was able to arrange with the help of several people for 8 professionals from the United States to go visited Ladakh for about 2 weeks and met with entrepreneurs there, with wool producers, with ecotourism operators, and what's what I'm missing? And we've also invited some architects. 3 architects are here as entrepreneurs. So that program, we call it the Columbia University Tibetan Rural Green Business Training and Exchange Program. And so the group went in April and May, and we will see some photos from that visit briefly. It's sort of a preview to Dr. Pasang Yangjee Sherpa's talk. And then our group just arrived a week ago. The 11 entrepreneurs came from Ladakh, Nepal, and Dharamsala. So we've been going around many places, and it's been a wonderful week. So you're welcome here. We've just had a nice reception for those of you who are online. Sorry you missed it. But thank you for joining us online here. So I'm going to start with to invite Jason Pardia up to the stage. And Jason was one of the 8 Americans who went over, and turned out had always wanted to go to Ladakh. And he's taken some beautiful pictures, beautiful photos. Jason himself is a Penobscot Nation Tribal Council member. He's also published in National Geographic and many other journals, and also does well, you can talk more about it if you want, but the birch bark canoe restoration is also some of the same issues, cultural preservation, et cetera, and keeping communities alive and thriving. So I'm going to so Jason will speak, and I'm going to just kind of scroll through your photos. Yeah.
Hello, all. My name is Jason Pardilla. Like Lauran said, I'm a member of the Penobscot Nation, located in Maine. I'm also on the Penobscot Tribal Council, but that's, as far as that's a different aspect. I am also a professional photographer, and I had the great opportunity to be invited to join the group to go to Ladakh, which ever since I first saw the photos of the Himalayas in National Geographic, I've always wanted to go. But since, the issues with China and Tibet, I knew my chances would be less. And then I had a group of friends who are professional whitewater kayakers, and they managed to do the Indus River from the glaciers to the ocean. And they told me that my best chance to ever visit the Himalayas was through Ladakh. And I had that conversation like 10 years ago, thinking I would never have the opportunity. But fortunately, this year, that opportunity presented itself. And I was lucky enough to be able to capture the images that we have placed around the room. Please take a look and, enjoy. I had a very great time in Ladakh, capturing these images, seeing the landscapes, meeting the people, and being able to talk to the people in the rural communities. I come to find out that some of their things that they were concerned about, my community has been concerned about for many years. So even though we were from very different cultures and distances, we had surprising similarities. And yeah, so, and that part, as far as like, my people are riverine people, so we're always connected. And Lauren mentioned the Birch Bark Canoe. We have a very forested landscape where my people are located. So to my community is one of the last communities that still make these traditional crafts. And we try to revitalize that with our neighboring communities. So it's always an ongoing effort to keep the traditional crafts alive. And I kind of saw some similarities in other communities that I was visiting in Ladakh. So I got to see their viewpoint, and I managed to bring some of their viewpoint to help my community. And hopefully some of the stories I shared will maybe help their communities as well. So, and I have to say, before Ladakh, I was mainly focused on landscapes, but I had taken portraits, you know, a lot of portraits, but after there, my portrait photography has exponentially changed and expanded. So.
Okay. And we also have with us tonight Dr. Pasang Yangjee Sherpa, who is a Sharwa from Parak, northeastern Nepal, popularly known as the Mount Everest region. She's an assistant professor of Lifeways in Indigenous Asia at the University of British Columbia. She is jointly appointed at the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies and the Department of Asian Studies. Her research employs community-based methodologies to explore collective survival on a warming planet, grounded in her long-term ethnographic study of Sherpa communities at home and within the diaspora and the human dimensions of climate change in the Himalayas. She examines these topics from a critical Indigenous perspective, focusing on the high Himalaya. Dr. Sherpa is a co-founder of the Knowledge Justice Collective, through which she and her collaborators seek to foster meaningful engagement across knowledge systems, recognizing the epistemological value of Indigenous knowledges in solving world problems. And we invited her here tonight, especially, this is actually her second invitation in just a few months here, because we've started a new climate change research project here at Columbia University. That is with Luce Foundation funding. It's a 5-year project. And our goal is that our program basically listens to the Indigenous peoples who are doing this work, and we just help to support what is needed and how can we help with what's here at Columbia and other resources, networking people to connect people for climate change research and to hear Indigenous knowledges and methods for working towards climate resiliency and addressing these issues. So that is and then Pasang Yangjee Sherpa joined our at quite short notice back in August, and I said we have to have you back. So this evening is this. So we're so grateful to have you. So you will come up here. The screen, as I understand it, right? You'll be able to see her slides on the screen. We will not be sharing screen on Zoom. You can see them quite well here. Thank you very much. Good, nice. Well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm quite short, so thank you, Lauren. And I'm just going to, okay. Okay, I think we have the right slides here. I just want to thank Lauran, the organizers here, Lauran and Julie, and everyone who worked behind the scenes, who I have not met, who were instrumental in putting this event together. Thank you very much. I also want to start by thanking Jason for that wonderful remark. At University of British Columbia, one of the things we have been trying to do is try to highlight the relationships Indigenous peoples internationally have with each other. And this is not something that is happening just now. This is something that has, has a history. And several, in terms of Indigenous movements, international Indigenous movements, we have decades and decades of global Indigenous leadership, and lots of history that we share in terms of addressing issues that matter to all of us, regardless of whether we live, regardless of whether we're a river people or mountain people. So thank you very much for the remarks. So I'll just go straight to the talk here. I plan to speak for roughly around 35 to 40 minutes. And I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, please keep them. And it might look odd, but I'm going to be carrying my laptop. So for the outline, I'm going to focus on three things. The first one is the Ecologies of Care initiative that was recently launched. Secondly, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think about Sherpa offering for collective survival on a warming planet, just this idea itself. Then focus on the extractive climate change studies in the Tibetan and Himalayan plateau as a way to think about the current research trends, but also in the hope that we will be changing how we do climate change studies in the Tibetan and Himalayan plateau. And the remarks that I'm going to present today for that are actually coming from three different systematic reviews of academic literature that are already out there, which is, and I'll talk more about this later, but reviews of global environmental literature. And so I'll end with a discussion and some concluding remarks. So to begin, I want to take you to where I come from. So this is some of you might know, this is Kumbila, and the village down there at the bottom is Monzo. That's where I'm from. That's where my father is from, and my mother is just below the hill there. Just before, if you have traveled to Khumbu, it's the village just before the steep climb to Namche. So I'm sure that will bring back memory if you have tracked through that part of Khumbu. So my personal offering is based on reflections of the many journeys I've taken away from home in Kathmandu and Farak to North America, and finding my way back each journey protected by the blessings of my grandparents, parents, and extended relatives. It is also based on the multi-sited ethnographic fieldwork I have conducted over the last 20 years in the Himalaya and North America among Sherpas, pursuing questions of indigeneity, migration, and climate change. So in my work, I evoke Sherifum, the concept, the Indigenous way of identifying myself as a Sherpa daughter to ground the research projects that I do in the Indigenous Sherpa ways of knowing and being. Sherifum I define as the powerful core within the matriarch that is wise, grounded, rooted, unafraid, and unconstrained. The qualities we have inherited from our ancestors from generations of survival on the highest, one of the harshest places on the planet. I describe the Sherpa cultural world from my vantage point as a Sherpa anthropologist from Farak, Greater Khumbu region, currently living on Musqueam land in British Columbia, through an engagement with Sherpa studies and Himalayan studies, but with a special attention to the contributions of political ecology within these fields of studies. I now apply critical Indigenous studies framework to center Sherpa ontology and epistemology within my inquiries. So the multidisciplinary analysis that I employ now is in dialogue with 3 sets of literature, and this is also based on what I'll present today. The first being the anthropological theories of the last 2 decades on more than human, multi-species, the Anthropocene, and the ontological turn. Secondly, multi-scalar interdisciplinary scientific examination of climate change and its impact on Indigenous communities. And thirdly, critical Indigenous scholarship of the global North, where my work has found a home to center Sherpa ontology and epistemology. So contemporary debates on ecological and civil crisis in a post-pandemic world emanating from Indigenous feminist and Black feminist studies have guided my assessment of racism, capitalism, and colonialism in the context of climate crisis. So living and dying in this process of exploration, interrogation, and examination have surfaced inexorably in my ongoing study of climate change impacts on Indigenous peoples. This project, therefore, my current research project, therefore gleans wisdom for relational caring through a rigorous and self-reflexive account of the fractures and sutures of Sherpa culture and identity to make this offering of living as an idea, which I present to you today. So I do recognize that the notion of indigeneity is still quite contested and quite complex, often defined as contested and complex in the Himalayan South Asian context, and definitely by South Asian scholars in South Asian studies. So I do want to present just a few ways I think about indigeneity and what that means to me and how I actually use that term. So indigeneity is about who we are, who we have always been, and how we want us to be recognized. It is about Indigenous ways of being and knowing, how Indigenous peoples live their Indigenous traditions in their everyday lives. And this is following the work of Sarah Hunt and Bernard Purley, Canadian First Nation scholars. Indigeneity is located on the land beneath our feet and above our head in the mountains. It is located in our bodies, it is located in our memories, it is located in our navigation of everyday spaces. Indigeneity is to recognize, to talk about indigeneity is to recognize the categories we are placed into and simultaneously imagine life without these categories. To think with indigeneity is to open our senses to all the ways we live it. Sherpa indigeneity is distinct. Similarly, indigeneity of another Indigenous people is distinct. Each Indigenous people have their own set of living histories, stories, songs, dances, foods, protocols, and traditions. Indigeneity offers a way for Indigenous peoples to relate to each other and those we share our world with. It expands the possibilities of responsible worlding as Indigenous peoples worldwide find themselves in complex web of wicked problems. Indigeneity is a powerful concept that illuminates our shared experience of erasure, dispossession, exploitation, and extraction, which occur at different scales and appear in different ways to the Indigenous peoples. All of this is to say that indigeneity as a concept does not homogenize us. The only thing every single Indigenous person in the world will agree, in my opinion, is the fact that we are different from each other. It opens up space for us to live out our heterogeneous selves. To speak of indigeneity is thus to speak of our plural and parallel existences. It is to recognize more than one way of being and knowing that is built around relationality, how we relate to each other, not coloniality. Indigeneity allows us to understand where we are, who we are, what we need, and who we have become. It helps us to see our lives at the interface of different cultural worlds. The struggle is to hold on to who we are while taking the next step on the pathway that was never designed with our wholeness in mind. So with this, I'm going to now move on to the first part of the talk that I wanted to share today, which is the Ecologies of Care initiative. This is an initiative that was recently launched at the UC Santa Cruz Center for South Asian Studies, now currently directed by Dr. Dolly Kikon, a Naga scholar from Northeast India. So the Ecologies of Care initiative was launched last month in October, and this multi-university initiative was hosted in partnership with the University of British Columbia, where I'm based, Simon Fraser University, and Lincoln University in New Zealand. So witnessing unbreathable air, unbearable temperature, and unimaginable disparities, we invited scholars of social sciences, and now we invite you, scholars of social sciences, arts, and humanities to address livability as a desired condition for all. Situated in the Himalayan region, the Ecologies of Care initiative included conversations across the boundaries of contemporary nation states, including Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Northeast India, and beyond. This region holds much of the world's snow and ice. It is home to many indigenous communities with hundreds of languages spoken and distinct colonial experiences that shape contemporary global indigenous movements in the region. Ecologies of Care focuses on tracing how peoples along the Himalayas cobble together livelihoods among rapidly shifting government-sponsored projects, including militarism, gender, environmentalism, and tourism. This initiative adopts an indigenous lens for a decolonial assessment of the current socio-ecological situation in South Asia and the paths forward to a livable future for all. What does it mean to live in this time of changing climates? Why do we show up for the care work required of us? How are relationships emboldened or refracted by ecologies of care? Existing situations force us to reassess our methodological tools as well. Centering care means adopting an ethic of responsibility, connections, and respect rather than the established notions of neutrality and objectivity. Ecologies of Care as a framework for life encourages scholars to reconfigure their independent individual research practice as interconnected nodes of life-sustaining forms of knowledge co-creation. So each of the people you saw in that picture and the people who are the wider community that's connected to the initiative, we are all doing our independent research. So it's not us coming together to do one project, but through this community, support each other in advancing our various projects for the well-being of all humanity. So Ecologies of Care envisions a collaborative dialogue to explore the Himalayan region's various intersections, expressions, and care practices. In centering indigenous philosophies, worldviews, and experiences, we view the Himalayan region as one where communities live creatively despite the odds and struggles. We fold together stories of struggle and care for the land with tales of love for fellow humans and other beings. We weave aspirations for justice, equality, and sovereignty into the everyday fabric of life. So this brings me to the main part of the talk today, which is the Sherpa offering for collective survival on warming planet. And in this part of the talk, I'm going to present some ideas, some lived experiences, and show you how I'm trying to make sense of the experiences around me. So one of the things I was thinking about as I was preparing for this talk was how this is, among all of the places I've talked and presented my research, this is most likely this is for me the most meaningful audience that I'm engaging with, because I know there are people present here in person and watching online from the Sherpa community, but I also know there are a lot of people from the greater Tibetan and Himalayan community. So I hope that the audience will see some relevance to their lives in what I present, and also the way I'm talking and making sense of our shared experiences, not same experiences, but shared experiences, how I'm making sense of it will hopefully provide tools and language to make sense in your own way, in your own life and work. So with this being said, 3 years ago, I started to think about living. This was a direct reaction to the extinction narrative that surrounded me at that time. I was in the middle of writing about Sherpa language and Himalayan glaciers based on what I was finding through my two very distinct research projects. One was understanding socioeconomic transformation in the lives of Sherpas from Khumbu and Farak, and the second one being understanding human dimensions of climate change in the Himalayas. These two research projects occasionally intersected and always informed each other. So how I was thinking about human dimensions of climate change was actually informed by what I was learning here in Queens, New York, and vice versa. So language loss was predicted in the literature, pointing to the decline in the number of speakers of the Sherpa language, and I was not comfortable with this prediction. And to accept this as a natural fact of life was something I could never be okay with. On the contrary, I was actually realizing through my research, based on participant observation of Sherpa culture at home in the mountains and in the diaspora, that the community actually had initiated so many efforts to not only keep the language alive, but also to promote and advance it. These efforts did not show that the language is dying. It had instead shown me that the language is living. The over-reliance on a singular metric that captures the number of speakers in the ethnographic present and compared against the past was not a meaningful approach to predict the future of language life. It also led me to conclude that the prediction of future as a research goal needs to be revisited. Who predicts? Based on what metrics? And who is served by that prediction? My exploration of living was also a direct reaction to the narratives about dying and death of glaciers around the world. A memorial for a glacier in Iceland made world news, drawing attention to the state of the world under climate change. It is not just the infrastructure that is lost with climate change. Our suffering also comes from the loss of our intimate relationships with the ecological beings. Death leaves behind grief. The memorial was a sensorial reminder of what living with climate change feels like. When I thought about glaciers in the Himalayas, I could not help but think about what might be understood as death in another part of the world, and from the mainstream viewpoint, could actually be understood from a cyclical nature of life as people understand in the Himalayas. Death represents the end of the physicality of existence, but it is also a beginning of a new stage of life. Needless to say, the fate of glaciers and glaciated regions in different parts of the world today as an effect of anthropogenic climate change is not uniform. In the Himalayas, we are dealing with rapid melting of glaciers and the subsequent formation and expansion of glacial lakes, which I now interpret as abruptly waking up glaciers when it should actually be sleeping. In other parts of the world, we are seeing the number of glaciers disappearing completely without a trace, and this number is rising. This is a reality of our time on this planet today. As I continued to think about glaciers, I also thought about how our lives are sustained by the presence of all beings in the material and immaterial forms we inhabit the planet with. Some of these beings exist in the realm our lay eyes cannot see. This does not mean they're not real. To survive as a Sherpa people, our relationships with these beings need to be kept alive. We maintain our relationships with all of the beings through offerings, the act of offering. Our responsibility to maintain these relationships does not end when we cross the arbitrary national borders. My aunt here in Queens, New York, who has not been to Nepal since she arrived here more than 15 years ago, reminds me of this. Also, our relationships with the mountains we belong to has to be kept alive. Our mountains extend beyond its measurable body. It extends to the glaciers, rivers, valleys, and villages. It is where humans co-inhabit with yaks, naks, yetis, and metis. Our mountains do not begin at the sea level and definitely does not end at the summit. So offering, activating living as a concept to understand Sherpa being and knowing allows us to reject the extinction that is predicted about us without us, and to assert our relationships that keep us alive. I use this concept then to define Sherpa offering as a methodology based on critical self-reflection and intergenerational care. Sherpa offering is a practice of Sherpa hospitality, an act of Sherpa sovereignty to build relationships of care. The evocation of offering is here is not to accept Sherpa's subservience to the colonial systems. It is not to provide the best of us for free, for entertainment, or for consumption, and I want to make that clear. It is instead an expression of our sovereignty and an invitation to the audience into a relationship of care. It is a call to action. It is instead a correction of the colonial harm done to Sherpas for centuries. I spell this out here because what has always been Sherpa hospitality, an act of service, has been misunderstood and misrepresented as accepting the role of a servant. A complete error in the reading of Sherpa hospitality, an act of sovereignty by the colonial mindset. So I want to take us to Thami and what happened there in August, to think a little bit about living with climate change and what that actually means. On August 16, a recently formed glacial lake flooded above Thami. The water gained speed as it came gushing down the valley and washed everything on its way. I chose this picture here from May of 2023 because this is how I want to remember Thami, and I hope you'll remember Thami. The water gained speed as it came gushing down the valley and washed everything on its way. A culturally vibrant and historically important Sherpa village of Thami in Khumbu, northeastern Nepal, changed right in front of the Thami families. This incident was recorded on cell phones and shared instantly with community members everywhere in the region and around the world. Like clockwork, relatives elsewhere started to gather support and provide relief to their fellow villagers. The water went from Thame towards Dudkoshi, taking more with it down the river. The air smelled like mud. My aunt told me hours after the glacial lake outburst flood downstream in Monzo. There was loud noise and a strong smell. Fresh from gloves loom in Khumbu as it does in other villages in other parts of the Himalayas. Within days, Thami villagers saw the land below their homes sink. Days after the flooding, only a few were spared. Any plan to rebuild homes after the flood was lost. A proper study of what happened is pending. So it is hard to say beyond speculations at this moment whether there was the sinking of the land is due to erosion caused by GLOF or permafrost thawing. It's hard to say what exactly happened. But the incident brought the permafrost as an important dimension to understanding the risk of living with climate change in Khumbu. And this was something that I myself had not adequately considered in my research previously because there was no need to, or that's what I thought. So risk from GLOF is only one of the many risks that Himalayan people face today. So with this, I want to come back to the third part of the talk, which is the extractive climate change studies in the Himalayas. Extractive climate change studies in the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau. So now I'm going to switch gears again and go specifically into the discussions of climate change studies. I present findings from the systematic reviews of global literature on environmental change that involve Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge. For the next part of my talk, I highlight findings from the 3 reviews here to show the trends and gaps in climate change research in the Tibetan and Himalayan region to help us design research that goes beyond acknowledging community, just acknowledging community, if any, to center the communities whose scientific insights help us better understand climate change and adaptation to climate change effects. I'll not go into the details of these studies, but I hope and I invite you to do so as you think about your own research or your own experience in the Himalayas. In David Chavez and Gavin's paper from 2018, the authors provide the first global systematic review of levels of Indigenous community participation and decision-making in all stages of the research process, from initiation, design, implementation, analysis, dissemination, in climate field studies that access Indigenous knowledge. They developed indicators for assessing responsible community engagement in research practice and identified patterns in levels of Indigenous community engagement. So what you're seeing here is the tool they use to identify what the levels of community participation was in each of the literature reviewed. They found that the vast majority of climate studies, 87%, practiced an extractive model in which outside researchers use Indigenous knowledge systems with minimal participation or decision-making authority from communities who hold them. Few studies reported on outputs that directly serve Indigenous communities. Only few studies were reporting outputs that directly serve Indigenous communities, ethical guidelines for research practice, or providing Indigenous community access to those findings. Further, studies initiated with, which is in mutual agreement between outside researchers and Indigenous communities, and by Indigenous community members, reported significantly more indicators for responsible community engagement when accessing Indigenous knowledges than the studies initiated by outside researchers alone. This global assessment provided an evidence base to inform our understanding of broader social impacts related to research design and concluded with a series of guiding questions and methods to support responsible research practice with Indigenous and local communities. So I really want to encourage our audience members here and joining us online to find this literature. But one of the things I do want to point out here, and also in the other studies, what I do want you to see is the just the concentration of the research. And as you can look on this map, the concentration of research is in what they can call the Tibetan Plateau. So in Petzel et al. 2020 paper, the authors investigated how evidence of Indigenous knowledge on climate change adaptation is geographically and thematically distributed in the peer-reviewed academic literature. The study provided an overview of the evidence of Indigenous knowledge for adaptation across regions and categorized relevant concepts related to Indigenous knowledge and their context in the climate change literature across disciplines. So now they were taking studies and looking at what the topics were, but also different disciplines that were studying them. And I wanted to include this here to show the different topics that were being studied. But this next picture, the results show knowledge clusters around tropical rural areas, subtropics, drylands, and adaptation. And knowledge gaps include research in Northern and Central Africa, Northern Asia, South America, Australia, urban areas, and adaptation through capacity building, as well as institutional and psychological adaptation. So these were the knowledge gaps. But definitely what we can see from both of the research, both of the papers, is that there is no lack of climate change studies in the Himalayas and Tibetan Plateau. There is actually, the Himalayan region and the Tibetan Plateau actually is one of the most researched areas. So And I wanted to bring this up here because I use the term indigenous, but indigenous is not necessarily applicable in different political contexts, especially in Asia. Different nation states do not want to use indigenous the way we understand here in North America. In that context, scientific literature, they tend to use indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and therefore the next study that we're going to look at has local knowledge in its title. But when they're talking about local knowledge, it's not, I'm not saying that they're the same, but there are some nuances that we need to be also considering when reading this. And therefore, the terms and concepts that they used, as you can see, indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, local knowledge, and traditional ecological knowledge, and others. So the next one, thirdly, Planck et al. 2017 conducted a systematic assessment of climate change adaptation literature to elicit major trends, discourses, and patterns in how local knowledge have been conceived. Results demonstrated that despite an increase in geographic and thematic diversity, and again, this paper is from 2017, so yeah, I wanted to note that so we understand when the papers were produced. So results demonstrated that despite an increase in geographic and thematic diversity, the climate adaptation literature tended to limit attention to perceptions of environmental change and practices associated with local livelihoods and traditional knowledge. Reflexive questioning of the process of local knowledge research was present, though they noted to a much lesser extent than would be expected given calls for re-engaging the public in science and knowledge production. The connections between themes further highlighted a concentration in themes where local knowledge is treated as an entity for documentation, utility, validation of science, and integration. So you can see how local knowledge, indigenous knowledge is even being treated in this context. So their systematic assessment documented the emphasis on extracting local knowledge in climate adaptation research, suggesting a need for researchers to become responsive to and reflexive about the purposes of involving local communities and stakeholders in adaptation research, which is, for example, to collect, record, assess, or to construct, learn, and transform ways of doing research and adaptation, and reflect on the ethical and political implications of such processes for how local communities and global scientific institutions envisions potential desirable futures. So in this case, one of the tables figures I didn't include, but I want to bring up here is how a lot of the climate change knowledge production is happening actually in the environmental sciences fields, and very less in the comparatively quite significantly less in social sciences and even more so in the humanities. And again, I wanted to include this from Planck 2017 paper where Asia is still showing there's a lot of representation of Asia, which is basically literature on Asia. And the way the local knowledge is engaged with or conceptualized are based on those different terms that they have in the box at the bottom. But basically, so there are different themes that they identify from perceptions to practices, response, co-production, integration, benchmark, barriers, impacts, reflexive questioning, loss, and priority. So all of this, the point behind bringing all of these systematic reviews to our attention is really to understand what climate change studies look like and what is being studied, how are things being studied, and what kinds of lens people are using in order to make those research in order to study climate change in the region. And again, I want to emphasize that there is no lack of climate change research. It's who does it, how we do it, and for what cause. That's the question we need to be asking. And to give you an example, my MA student, Mason Stewart, who is in the process of finishing his thesis, one of the things he discovered in his research was that Globally, the rate of scientific literature production is below 5, whereas just for Sherpas and Khumbu, and again, Sherpas and Khumbu represent a very unique situation, but just the research on Khumbu and Sherpas is above the rate at which the scientific literature is being produced is more than the global average. So this is something I wanted to show from the Thame glacial lake outburst flood. So I mean, this is hours after the flood happened on August 16 of this year. People online were already putting up images and trying to come up with their theories of what was happening, because at this time we were not even sure that the cause was really a glacial lake outburst flood. And the next day, and the day of the flooding, the weather was bad, so the helicopters could not even be used to go to see what had happened, what caused the flood. So the picture from the next day showed us with evidence that it was indeed a glacial lake outburst flood that had caused the destruction. But the interesting thing about the Thame Gulf is that it is from a glacial lake that was recently formed. It was not one of the critical glacial lakes that the scientists have been studied. It had been recently formed, and the most important thing to note is the fact that this is not even a big glacial lake. It's a tiny glacial lake that was recently formed, but the destruction that it left behind was so, yeah, like it was just very devastating. So when I'm using this idea of living in my research and thinking about collective survival, I am really changing how we think about Indigenous peoples, not just in the Himalayas, but also globally, and really rejecting the narrative of extinction, narrative of death and dying, and really putting an emphasis, putting the spotlight on how we have actually survived. And this is something that I did not, this is not my idea. This is an idea that has been built and informed by Indigenous scholars from North America who have, like Kyle White, who have written about the multiple crises Indigenous peoples here have already lived through. So the current ecological crisis is just one of the new crisis. And so not saying that the experience in the Himalayas is the same as North America. In fact, they're not the same. However, this ability and the desire to survive and live is something I believe everyone can relate to. And the analysis and the discussion of Sherpas at the planetary scale, responding to the scale of humanity, talking about climate crisis, ecological crisis, is also a call to adjust our analytical skills in Himalayan studies to meet the reality of Indigenous peoples today. So, Indigenous peoples are not just people who we need to study, but also our partners in knowledge co-creation, who have already made important contributions and whose contributions need to be recognized. So with this, I'm going to conclude my talk. And at the end of my talks related to climate change, nowadays I usually offer a prayer to the audience. And I want to offer that to you. The prayer goes, when the fire burns, when the lake floods, when the earth cracks, and when the wind storms, I pray that there is someone to lend you a hand. This prayer comes from experience and knowledge accumulated over the years, informed by the various knowledge systems I engage with in my research. We know from climate change assessments and lived experiences that weather pattern has become unpredictable and extreme events are more frequent. So each of us here in this room and online on Zoom have either already experienced firsthand what extreme weather events feel like, look like, or know someone close to us who has. Of course, the impact of these extreme events is differently experienced by each one of us. It is not the same for all. The prayer then is offered to the audience with an intention of care, a relief at the moment of crisis. It is a sign of respect and a call to action. The witnesses are called to care, to be that someone who will lend a hand. For care to work, the exchange has to be reciprocal. Providing care is important, but so is receiving care. The reality of climate change means that not only are the effects of climate change unpredictable, but also who provides and who receives care is unpredictable. It could be any one of us at any moment. After the earthquake in 2015 that devastated many parts of Nepal, including several villages in Khumbu and Farak, relief came to those in need in the form of the people who showed up to clear the rubble, provide hot tea, blankets, and shelter. Knowing that someone is there and someone cares make living possible. Thank you.
Now I'm reminded why I wanted you back here to help and to really show us, you know, I think your presentation is very much about finding ways forward, as you worded it. I was very struck by what you said, and I jotted down these words, but I was especially moved by this. You said the challenge is to hold on to who we are before taking the next step on a path that never had our wholeness in mind. And yeah, it's very powerful way of putting it. And I also think about, so we've been hosting 11 visitors here this week, right? And some of these same themes come up, and the extraction, some of, you know, these same sorts of themes that people here are dealing with. So I really do hope you will engage. And on top of that, we also have one of our fellows also did a film, right? Tashi Lanzo. Some of the references you made are just No Monastery, was it No Monastery, No Village, about a glacial flood. The threat of glacial flood and the waters coming through and the smell of mud. You had exactly, was your mother or your aunt who had referred to the same. So just this very lived experiences that in common and yet different experiences. So it seems really important to have this space to talk about this. I guess I would like to, I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, the path that never had our wholeness in mind. Where do you find strength to do the work you do? I think you've really found some inspiration in this theme of living. It's very inspiring. Do you want to talk about how you came around to that?
Thank you so much for that question. I think this is something a lot of people here in this room and also on Zoom can relate to, where we've had to overcome our own challenges, right? And in my case, I did have my own set of challenges that I had to overcome. And every time realizing that I had to become somebody I knew I was not, you know, to fit in, to get the job, to get that grant, or to do this and to do that. And we're trained, we're disciplined into being somebody who we are not. And that leaves us exhausted. And that drains us. And that is not productive. That is not helpful. And for me, climate change and the current time that we're living in, it really makes us, I think it's really asking us to be ourselves, bring our best selves to work. And I actually do believe that, because what we're experiencing now is nothing. I don't want to say nothing, but it's what we're facing, the challenges we are facing is greater than what we are actually experiencing. And what we are experiencing right now is already so hard. And so how do we do that? How do we bring our best selves? And in order to answer that question, I always come back to the work of care.
how we care for ourselves and how we care for each other, and how we show up so that we are caring, making sure that everyone is cared for. And so this is why I come here. And it's, to me, I have to admit, it's very difficult to present a talk like this because I'm trained into like providing evidence and scientific literature and the research. And I'm trained in a way to talk about, this is where I went, did my field work, this is what I found, but really that's not going to help. As we know, like there's already so much climate change study that has happened and so much that are being produced. And now with remote sensing, climate change literature is being produced without even actually going to the Himalayas, about Himalayas. And in this context, like how do we find space for ourselves? And how do we present ourselves and engage with the scientists in a way that is meaningful for everyone?
That's one of the questions I wanted to ask you about. So you rightly criticize this sort of extractive nature. One way to look at Indigenous knowledge is like, oh, what can, right, and I'm certainly not a scientist, but yeah, but thinking, what can science learn from the Indigenous peoples, right? Which again is just replicative, is that the word? Replicating this extractive approach. With what you said now, this is very interesting. There is so much work, and we who work in Tibetan studies, right, and might be, reading about the minutia, these are really important, critical questions. So if the research is out there, what do you have done the work of reading a lot of this. What do you see as a blueprint for moving forward a little more oomph and effectiveness, like efficacy? What's needed now? Yeah.
Thank you so much for asking that question, because we know that there's a lot of literature, but we know that it's also not useful to us. And when I say we, I'm thinking about Indigenous peoples from the Himalayas. So, and one of the reasons why I brought up Thami experience, the GLOF that happened recently in Thami, is because despite the fact that the scientific literature production in Khumbu is above global average, we did not have, and we do not have scientific studies that allow us to understand risk that communities on the other side of Kumbila face. And so most of the scientific literature in Khumbu that are produced are based on the villages and sites on the trail to Mount Everest, not off the trail. And also, I wanted to bring this, and I had to think about this very much in terms of like why present Sherpa offering, and why not make all Himalayan people. But I speak of Sherpa offering because it is something that I know best. But it is also in that process of bringing and revealing things from within Khumbu, from the Sherpa community. It is my hope that we begin to see that Khumbu and Sherpas are not the only Indigenous peoples in the Himalayas and in the Tibetan Plateau. So like what happened in Halji, for example, we don't have a lot of information. I can actually tell you exactly which researcher went and exactly who did the research. And I can tell exactly like how many people have been to Dolpo or not in terms of climate change adaptation research. And the reason why is because so much of our attention, so much of the attention of the researchers and scientists are based on where they want to go, ask the questions they want to find answers to, and are funded by organizations that have certain values, that they want to uphold. And it's not necessarily the Indigenous communities, our issues, our sustainability. These are not on the table. And I can say that very firmly because we have the Hindu Kush Himalaya assessment report currently out. It's a very important report, and I highly recommend that report as something to study. But I also want to point out that when they think about sustainability, they're thinking about the sustainability of the natural resources. They're not thinking about the sustainability of the homes of people. They're definitely not thinking about sustainability of Indigenous peoples and communities in the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau. If we're thinking about sustainability of Himalayan peoples, we have to think about the diaspora. Every time something happens in our villages, the diaspora gets activated. The diaspora is the one that's going to gather support, collect relief support, and send it back home. They're the ones, the first ones to show up. They're the last ones to leave. Right. And so in this context, when we're thinking about the Himalayan region from a climate change perspective, we're so place-based and static. So what I mean by that is we're thinking about Himalayan peoples only as peoples who are living there living there all year round. And there is a certain imagination of who an Indigenous person is from the Himalayas. And that imagination does not include me. That imagination does not include people in this room. But if we are really serious about thinking about our peoples, thinking about our peoplehood and our sustainability, not just as one Indigenous community, but Indigenous communities in together, then we do have to raise these issues.
Is it about, would you put more resources towards predicting? Like, do you think, like, what would really help concretely in terms of helping sustainability at a very
Yeah.
meaningful level?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. I think in this case really is the capacity building. And that's why one of the reasons why I so appreciated the conversations from the very beginning with you is the focus on capacity building. It's not like I cannot tell you what's needed for Halji community members, right? Halji community members will know the best what they need for themselves, but providing the tools and the languages and the resources to enable communities to talk about things that are needed for them, I think that is where we need to focus on.
Could you talk a little bit more about the Ecologies of Care project and then any other model projects that you'd like to give a shout out to? Yeah.
Sure. I can talk a little bit about the Ecologies of Care, and I can also talk about the Knowledge Justice Collective, which I didn't include in my presentation. So the Ecologies of Care is really an initiative to change the way we do research. And so in this case, we're changing the way we do research by not competing with our partners. So I'm not in competition with Dolly Kikon. I'm not in competition with Ritori Chakravarti. I'm not in competition with Michael Hathaway. But what we are doing is we are identifying the common values, common themes, and common challenges to work on. So each of us are able to do the good work that we can do together. And what this also means is and the reason why we're also doing this is to recognize that alone, we're not going to address climate change. It requires a community. And how do we build that community? And how do we build a community of researchers? How do we cover different parts of the world? You know, I cannot go everywhere. I don't know anyone who can go everywhere. But with remote sensing and the kind of technologies that are currently developed, it makes you believe that you can just be one person, you know, solving all of the world problems, or you can do that. But that's not the reality. That's not how humans work. Humans are limited by our ability to do things.
And that's Ecologies of Care. Did you want to
Yes.
speak to the Knowledge Justice Project?
Sure. So the Knowledge Justice Collective really was born out of the frustration of seeing the climate change research in the Himalayas use a very technocratic, techno-managerial approach, especially when it comes to climate change adaptation work. And over-reliance on biophysical science and not enough attention or collaboration with Indigenous sciences. I now use Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge together to recognize the science that Indigenous peoples do. And so one of the things we did, which a lot of people might be familiar with, is to put out articles based on, we did something similar to the systematic reviews that you saw here, but we're really looking at all of the critical studies that have come out of the out of the Himalayan region.
Mm-hmm.
And so the co-authors when I say we, it's a group of 4 people, Ritori, Mabel, myself and Costanza. So the four of us, we put out this approach calling for a plural climate studies framework. So we cannot think about climate change from purely Euro-Western epistemic lens. It's just not going to work for the Himalayas. If we do that, there's going to be no room for our gods, because spirituality has no room in Euro-Western science. But when you think about people, and when we think about the Himalayan region, I don't know any single place without gods or spirits. And so in this context, if we are to take that even seriously, we have to have plural climate studies framework. And this is just one example of why plural climate studies framework, right? And so what we were doing essentially was trying to make space for other ways of addressing climate issues. And so this is where, it's great that we have projects, to support Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples. But if we don't make intellectual space for them to then publish, then to present, it's like hitting the ceiling again and again and going nowhere. So the work of the Knowledge Justice Collective is really to open up space for us to then think about and see the possibility of being able to engage with multiple knowledge systems as a way to address and engage with climate realities. But again, as our work expanded, we now, one of the things we've been doing is, and one of the research we just completed is both Ritori Chakravarti and I are contributing authors to the latest IPCC climate assessment report, the 6th assessment report. And based on our experiences, we wrote this critical reflection piece where we had very different participation in the IPCC process. Whereas Ritori had more of a say in the chapters he was involved in, I felt like my presence was more for my name, for the tokenistic inclusion of an Indigenous person, a woman from Nepal. So that's how I see my participation. But what we ended up doing is we took the IPCC assessment report and looked at every single chapter. And we have, within IPCC assessment reports, there are working group 1, 2, and 3. So we took a look at we reviewed all of the chapters and the references they cited, which is like 86,000 references. And we mapped out how Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledges are engaged in this work. And again, this is just another example of, proving what we already know, which is not in meaningful ways. But one of the things that was one of my findings, my realization from this process was that there are actually 2 chapters within the IPCC assessment report that's very important to Indigenous, international Indigenous movements. The first chapter comes from North America. And this chapter includes a lot of Indigenous scholars from North America, and they present a very Indigenous-centered way of thinking about climate change understanding climate change and adapting to climate change. And one of the things they were also successful in doing was to put, for the first time in the IPCC report, the word colonialism. And so now the 6th assessment report has in their document recognized colonialism as one of the causes of climate change. And this is possible because of the Indigenous scholars who were involved in those chapters. So the 6th assessment report is not necessarily all, detrimental to Indigenous peoples. It's actually quite helpful and useful. However, again, at the same time, I also realized that IPCC is part of the colonial system that continues to suppress Indigenous peoples. So on the one hand, Indigenous peoples worldwide, I think, have to do multiple things. One is trying to make space within the colonial systems, but then also understand and imagine and bring to life alternative spaces where they can be themselves. And this brings me to your first point that you were thinking about, which is not having our wholeness in mind. Right. And so when we are thinking about IPCC, when we are thinking about UN, when we are thinking about climate change studies or Euro-Western science, these are spaces that have not considered our wholeness. And we need to change these systems, but at the same time, we also have the burden and a responsibility to create spaces where we can be ourselves without having to prove something, without having to be someone else.
On that note, let's open it up to other people here for questions in the room. Remind you the microphone's in the back. So if you'd like to ask a question directly, please do. Just step up to the mic and connect. And for those of you who are online, I guess our system is that you need to write it into the Q&A and I will relay it. That's just how the technology is set up. So great. Thank you so much. Please, yeah. If you would like to, you can also identify yourself as you
Sure.
wish or not.
Hi, namaste. My name is Sonam Sherpa. I'm an architect and I'm an adjunct assistant professor here at the Graduate School of Architecture, Columbia. I'm also part of the engineering community with United Sherpa Association in Queens. So my question to you is going to be somewhat related to like construction ecologies. But I think throughout my career, I've been given the privilege to visit a lot of famous buildings around the world. But the most incredible spaces have been in some of the rural parts of the world that I've been to that have just been spaces that are like built by local craftsmen with just the resources that they have. And Solukhumbu is one of the examples of that, which is also where my family's from. And that kind of sometimes makes me question what my role is as an architect. But something that I struggle with to a greater degree is those spaces, while being incredible, they still have their discrepancies when we start to like address climate change and things like that. So I think my question to you is just how do you start that dialogue with, because the local craftsmen, that's just also part of the local knowledge that you're talking about in these indigenous communities. So like, how do you start this dialogue without having a negative connotation where you're coming from, where you try to address these issues and try to propose new solutions, but you don't come off as someone who's just like, oh, I have the Western education, your local knowledge is wrong. This is the right way to do it. So, I mean, even though my family is from there, you know, I haven't lived there long enough to kind of propose that idea. So that's something I struggle with. So how do you start that dialogue? I think that's just my question to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I was smiling because I understand where you're coming from. I've been through that myself. And I see that again and again. I think the most important thing is to first recognize that the community are quite smart and they've been doing this themselves. What I mean by this is like, so in Khumbu, actually, like immediately after the atomic glove, the community mobilized themselves to find different ways of dealing with, well, first of all, identifying the risk and dealing with those potential risk or managing risk in a way, right? So I think the community is already doing that. So I think it's important that we recognize that, you know, the community, we recognize that there are people within the community, and of course, all community have people with different opinions. So that's just the reality. But within the community, there are enough people who are innovating, who are changing their traditional ways of doing things to meet the requirements of today. So, for example, you know, in Khumbu, like the way our grandparents lived and the way we live today in Khumbu is completely different. And it's a result of community innovating, community adapting to tourism industry and different kinds of, you know, lifestyles. So I think that kind of evolution and change is already happening. And then there's, I think, another thing we need to recognize, which is this romanticization. So when we talk about Indigenous knowledge, I think we tend to think of Indigenous knowledge as something that is static and something that belongs to our grandparents and not something that we are actually doing today. And so even after the earthquake, for example, a lot of the houses that were flattened, let's say in Sorikarka or Rimajung, in Farak, those houses, look, the structures that stood were the ones that were built traditionally. So these were like older homes. However, there were parts of those homes that had completely gone, right? So it's like the community is already doing their own risk assessment and already figuring out, okay, what works, what doesn't work, but also in today's time, like today, currently, also how much money the community members actually have to rebuild their homes and what kinds of materials to use and what kinds of regulations are now in place that wasn't in place in the past. So all of these things are happening. But I will say one additional thing that I think a lot of people don't talk about, which is when our ancestors built homes in the past, they were not thinking about climate change. They didn't have to think about climate change. The reality today is climate change is happening at like the effects are happening at such a speed and so frequently that I don't think our community has even enough time to breathe before the next disaster, right? And so in that context, if you are not even able to breathe and, how do you have the capacity as a community to innovate and to do things that we associate with a good life? And so that's what I want us to think about, like, so our ancestral traditional ways of doing things worked for that environment, but the environment itself has changed so much and is beyond our control, and our gods are getting weaker.
Thank you.
We had a case, Jampadundab, right, who's in our program, was talking about the rains are coming down more. And if you have a mud roof, right, and you have a lot more rain coming, that's a challenge. If those of you in architecture here, do you want to raise your hands so you can find each other? Anybody who's doing architectural related work? That's, yeah, maybe if you haven't met yet, share notes. Yes.
Hi, Tongwei. My name is Tenzing Doma Sherpa. I'm actually a recent graduate of the Modern Tibetan Studies program, so so fantastic to see everybody here. Nga de ela show labshiji tumuji labjin thamati la nga English la tuati tijin. Tama kirangi research si saru interesting chungsong wurong shirimi ki lagi dugo climate change research tang interdisciplinary research saru important inza thamati lagi kirang la tujira tujin. I'm curious to know, just from maybe your experience, also maybe like personal story-wise as well, in your research, when you're interacting with people in Kumbu now, how are they discussing climate change among one another? So I think the discussion varies, at least in my experience, when I'm meeting with Sherwas in Kumjong, for example, Namche, Hame, it's all different, right? Their conversations within the village seem different than conversations that are being had with Sherpas, for example, in the United States. And so I'm just curious, what does that dialogue look like right now in your research? And in your personal experience growing up, what is dialogue about climate change? What did it look like for you, or at least your relationship to where you grew up? How did your parents speak to you about that as well?
Mm-hmm. Lots of questions.
Yeah, I know lots.
Sorry. No, that's great. Thank you so much. Oh, I almost forgot to mention something earlier when Lauren was asking. So one of the things I realized this week, actually just 2 days ago, so I had mentioned that my student, MA student, is now publishing his thesis or in the process of producing his thesis. And one of the things he does is look at all of the climate change studies that have taken place and put them in this category that we showed here from David Chavez and Gavin, like whether the research was contractual, where Sherpas were hired, or it was really indigenous. So if we were taking that spectrum as a way of thinking about different kinds of research. A rude awakening. My research is also not very indigenous, right? And so there are elements of extraction there. And because the work I've published is from a time, so I conducted my doctoral dissertation between 2009, like the research was done between 2009 and 2011. This was a time, and I'm trained as an anthropologist, so I was doing this as an anthropologist. So what I ended up doing was for my doctoral dissertation, look at Sherpa perceptions of climate change and institutional responses to climate change effects. And somebody told me I have a terrible, I cannot give good titles, which is true. I'm still working on it. But I hope over the years I've gotten better. But in any case, the point is it directly connects to what you're asking, right? And so how are Sherpa people, especially in Khumbu, where I did my research, talking about among themselves about climate change? So what I saw in 2009 and what I'm seeing today is completely different. So in 2009, it was very interesting. So the first interesting thing for me was realizing that when I said climate change, people were comfortable using the English phrase climate change and not necessarily the Nepali Jalvayu Parivartan. And this is, I concluded, a result of the exposure to NGOs from Kathmandu and governmental, non-governmental organizations who were conducting climate change related activities in the Khumbu region, but also the tourists who were coming, and most of the tourists and NGOs officials do use the English phrase climate change, right? And so that was the case. But the biggest finding of my research was that the way the communities were experiencing climate change was different from how the NGOs were using the word climate change. And depending on who you spoke to, whether you spoke to a middle-aged man from the one of the on-trail villages, you got a very NGO-like answer of what or response to climate change, understanding of climate change. But when you just went across the bridge and when you met an older woman just working in her fields and asked her about the changes in her environment, it was a very completely different answer. And again, you could do that, and then a hotel owner has their own way of talking about climate change. But in that, at that time, climate change was definitely not something people were interested in talking about, because they were most occupied with tourism industry, and they wanted to talk about tourism industry. And if they had to rank, which is what I asked them to do, if they, so I requested like some of my relatives to rank what was important to them. And tourism was by far the most important thing because their livelihood depends on it. Whereas climate change at that time was still like something of the future, something that's going to happen in the future, something that's not connected to us. The situation is not dire enough for, at that time for people to talk about it, think about it. Fast forward to 2024, I think now the community understands the risk more. They have seen more, they have experienced more, they know more because of media, technology, social media, and just how many people, they're engaging with, and what kinds of knowledge, like information sources they're engaging with. All of this has led to a situation where people are more aware of the risk and talking openly about it. And so it's a very different. And for the first time, and I've been doing this research for a very long time, but the first time this year, I was invited to join community-led exploration of risk, climate risk. And in fact, I'm happy to share this with you, that human dimensions of climate change from the Khumbu region, none of them cite me, but I see my ideas in their studies. But if you look at the most recent human dimensions of climate change research, you won't see me in the references. And for me, I have to point this out because this is how erasure happens, and this is how long-term ethnographic fieldwork gets discounted in the name of trying to get more scientific research done.
We have a couple of questions online. So one question, somebody is Tanzanima Bhutia, research scholar from Sikkim, is online, and adjunct professor at Sikkim Manipal University. It's 5 a.m. here in India. Trying to stay awake. I woke up early for this. My question is, I'm curious about the Sherpa offerings in a spiritual sense, the changes in the environment and the newer spiritual Sherpa offerings in contrast to the earlier methods. Could you give us the gist of this or a few keywords that I could look up so they could look into this more closely?
First of all, thank you so much for waking up early for the talk. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
But I will say, like, this is something I'm writing right now, so you may not find a lot of the way I'm using it. But this, the way I'm using Sherpa offering in my research is also the result of the fact that, you know, I'm now finally here in research space. So much of Sherpa research has been like almost all of the Sherpa canons, you know, are written by non-Sherpa people, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it does show different elements and different sides of Sherpa, and it does show us different. It shows us that people were interested in different questions that may not necessarily align with how I'm thinking about Sherpa today. But in terms of offering, I would encourage Tenzing to think about how Tenzing thinks about or practices offering in their everyday life, how their family practices act of offering, what that offering entails, what it includes, so this is not necessarily the materiality of what is being offered, right? So like the offering of incense to mountains, for example, that is one form of offering. But the way I'm thinking about offering in the research context is to think about how I want the readers to engage with my work. So I'm offering my ideas, my knowledge, not to be extracted from and not to be exploited, but to be taken with care and engaged with, because we're all in this together, in the sense that we're all trying to find ways to survive.
I remember you'd mentioned something about offering as a sort of a call to care for each other and to, right, brings attention. I just was remembering that from your talk. We have a second question here as well. As someone, this is an anonymous attendee, as someone who works in a field where Indigenous people, especially those of us from the Himalayas, are made both invisible and hypervisible, how do you take care to keep your work and community protected and away from extractive eyes and powers?
It's a hard question, right? Like you just have to be conscious every day, and you just have to be conscious every day and be okay with the fact that you will make mistakes.
It's kind of interesting. Yeah, keeping away from extractive eyes and powers, and yet at the same time, you spoke of an erasure.
Yes,
People not seeing your work, right?
Yeah,
Or acknowledging. Yeah,
yeah,
it's a
yeah, and it's
sword.
yeah. So, and like speaking of Sherpa, right? On the one hand, we are hyper visible, but we are also invisible clearly, because our issues have not appeared the way we want them to appear. You know, we still have Oxford English Dictionary defining Sherpa as porters. You know, we still have Oxford English Dictionary defining Sherpas not just as porters. Now we have more than that, actually. We have, like somebody who helps this big conferences happen, you know, and so there's the Sherpa or has been twisted so much
Mm.
and misappropriated in so many
Mm.
ways. And so like, and then again, the challenges we're facing, right? So when it comes to research, for example, like it's not that the research hasn't happened, but it hasn't happened in our own terms.
Mm.
It hasn't happened with our care in mind.
Which is a question I'd like to ask, and I know we're coming to an end. Please do put any last questions into the chat or come to the mic here. But on that note, I'd like to ask you, I have heard people say, and I think this came out in our discussions in August, that the information, the research being done needs to reach the people, that if
Mhm.
they knew about, if they were reading these research and knew the findings, they might be able to protect themselves more or take precaution. Do you agree with that, having really read this material, and what might be a means to share, bring some of this information to communities with their needs in mind?
Yeah, it's quite amazing actually, you know, like the communities from the Himalayas, we already know each other. That's
Mhm.
that's the best part, right? Like we already know who's doing what. Like we already know what's up and what's, you know, happening. And so building on that and making sure whoever we are, wherever we are, we use our platform and the resources to uplift and highlight the work, but also nurture. And and I was informed by Dolly Kekon, no, as an Indigenous sister, like really letting me know that, you know, we also need to do the work of an elder. In nurturing the next generation. And that's not just being nice and smiling all the time. Sometimes we need to use our auntie voices. Sometimes we need to use our, you know, sister voices and tell them what's up, you know? And so already building on the connections and networks that we already have within the community, but also using those connections and networks to uplift and amplify and to nurture and support each other instead of seeing ourselves as in competition with them to have this very special, you know, position within the colonial system. So that's not how, that's the opposite of ecologies of care.
I have 2 questions. Yeah.
Ashley, thank you, Pasang, for the presentation. It was very informative and a lot of food for thought for amateur researchers like myself. So my name is Tenzin Palmo and I'm from Ladakh. So I've done a bit of research in the Changtang area of Ladakh with pastoralists. And my question, I think, builds on the comments that you have made before and the questions that was asked before. So as a researcher, how do we like what steps do we have to take to not be extractive? So as you would know, like research work can be very lonely. So in most of the anthropological research would publish papers, right? And how to be not extractive in our research? Like what do we have to take care of in our mind? And secondly is as a researcher, we go into the field, right? And then we see different aspects of how the field works. And as you had suggested, that communities would know, they're already assessing the risk of climate change and everything. So as researcher, should we just observe, or where should our moral arc be? Should we just keep that aside? Or should, like, maybe I view the future of Changtang in a particular way, and the Changpas view the future of Changtang in a particular way. So how do we navigate that different futures as a researcher and also as partners in our research? So these are 2 different questions.
Yeah, no, I think, but they're connected questions, right? So, and I was thinking about David Chavez and Gavin's. I hope you find that article and look at it. It has this table where, you know, you engage with the community either contractually by hiring them to do certain things, or you engage with them from the very beginning and ask, okay, what kind of research is even needed? You know, and what can we do with our research skills that will actually help you or fill the needs in the community. So for example, right now with the risk assessment in Kumbu, there's so much work that needs to happen, and the capacity, the community does not have all of the capacity, right? So like in order to understand permafrost thawing, like I don't have the skills. I don't know if that's even a valid question or a reasonable question in Khumbu, you know. So I have to partner with somebody who has that skill. And so this is then the opening is for those kinds of partnerships, right? And so as a researcher, I think designing your research that fills the need of the community, and doing that by making sure that you are in consultation with the community from the very beginning. And this is not a research on or necessarily about the community, but research with. And maybe the research might be led by the community, right? And so I think those kinds of framing might be very helpful.
This will be our
Hi.
last question now, and yeah, then we'll close.
Hi, my name is Melissa Tapamogar, and I'm from the Graduate School of Education, Psychology, and Health. And I just wanted to say, also, I read your Sustaining Sherpa paper, which I really enjoyed, by the way. But just for some context, I work with Himalayan youths in New York City at a nonprofit, and they come from a variety of Indigenous groups, such as Mogar, Kirati, Sherpa, and many more. And I've noticed like a lot of climate change education sources that do utilize Indigenous knowledge are primarily based in like North America. And so I just wanted to ask from like an educator perspective, do you have like any advice how to use climate change education to support Indigenous identities of my students, especially when they are from a variety of different groups? And on top of that, they are in the diaspora.
Mhm. Okay, I was just asking myself, thinking about what I do in my classroom, and I was wondering if like what I do in the classroom is actually helpful or not helpful. But really, so one of the things I do in my classroom, and I taught Indigenous Peoples and Climate Change course this year. And one of the things I did was try to provide resources and materials and skills to the students to then help them formulate their own questions and formulate their own ideas and solutions. And one of the things we do regularly, because that's how we have been trained to do, is come up with this definition of climate change and then tell the students to memorize or like understand or be able to repeat that definition of climate change. And you know, that just doesn't work. You know, how climate change is experienced in Queens is so different from how it's experienced in Kathmandu, you know. And so I think my focus is more on providing the resources and materials and skills to the students for them to then ask the question, generate questions for themselves, and enable them to find answers for themselves. It might not necessarily be a satisfying answer, but I think it works.
I mean, also just to recall again your own words in your talk that also struck me and maybe relates to your class, but you had said, if I have this right, indigeneity does not homogenize us. It provides us a space to speak of our parallel and plural existences. Which it seems like it might also be something that could be related. And right, you have the different Himalayan people from the different origins, but kind of comparing and and contrasting and sharing those experiences, maybe.
Yeah, and also the last thing I will say, I know it's already late, but the last thing I will say is, you know, for me, indigeneity is very helpful for a humanity-based framework to critical analysis, because it helps us decenter nation states. And it helps us to erase borders that we build around ourselves, where we think of each other as competitors and not fellow humans.
Beautiful note to end on. All right. Thank you. Thanks to everybody who showed up here. Just a huge clap here. And Thanks to people who showed up online. I also want to thank the staff here at SEPA who've been helping with the AV, Julie Kwan, Weatherhead East Asian Institute, provided funding, the Henry Luce Foundation, who provided the funding that allowed us to become acquainted and to start collaborating together. And to Jason for visiting us with your beautiful, beautiful photos of Ladakh. And finally to you yourself, Dr. Pasang Yangjee Sherpa. It's I hope you will keep dialoguing with us and we just wish you so much best wishes for your very important work. That's all I can say. Thank you.